Hello! So, firstly, thank you very much to the organisers for allowing me to share this presentation with you. And I'm sorry I can't be there live, but if you have any questions about anything on the presentation, do just drop me an email and I'll do my best to answer it. So, the whole theme of this talk is really a conundrum I've been tackling with the Portable Antiquities Scheme database, and in terms of identifying Bronze Age hoards that are being recorded on there. I have a couple of aims for this presentation, hopefully in the first instance to share with you some interesting Bronze Age landscapes and to demonstrate one way that finds clusters recorded on the PAS database could be categorised and understood. I'm hoping that by doing so, I'll provide a case study of the underutilised potential of the PAS database and hopefully highlight some opportunities for yourselves to do further research using that data in different counties. To do that, I'll first do a quick 101 on Bronze Age finds on the PAS database and the Treasure Act. And then I'm going to share two odd cases from Oxfordshire of Bronze Age metalwork clusters, which led me to this topic. And then we're going to get into the real meat and bones of the presentation, which is all these different clusters we've been identifying and how they could be understood. But first, a quick background on the Portable Antiquities Scheme database. Now, every year, there are around 35 Bronze Age hoards reported from England and Wales, which are reported through the Treasure Base and recorded on the PAS database. And this has resulted in a dataset of over 500 Bronze Age hoards being recorded on that website. Now, to give you some context, there's around 2,100 hoards that I'm aware of in England, Scotland and Wales, so it represents nearly a quarter of all the data that we have out there. And now, in addition to this, we have 10,000 records of single finds of Bronze Age metalwork, and that's before you do any sort of jiggery-pokery filtering the data. If you have a look at some of these graphs here, what you'll see is that there's an increase in the number of hoards and in the number of metalwork around about 2002. Now, this is unsurprising because it was in 2002 that we had the second revision of the Treasure Act. And this placed a legal obligation on metal detectors to report Bronze Age metalwork hoards, defined as having two or more base metal objects originally deposited in the same place at the same time. And as a result, we saw the reporting of these Bronze Age hoards increase massively on what had been recorded previously. So you might be thinking at this point, okay, so we've got the Treasure Act, it's kind of defining what hoards are. What's the problem? Well, that's what I'm going to show you with these next two case studies. So the first of these case studies involves these two Middle Bronze Age Palstave axe heads. The one in the middle I recorded when I just started out being a flow in 2020. However, it wasn't until a couple of years later in 2022 I realised that this fit the definition of what's called a debass type palstave. These are imported generally from Central and Northern Europe and have really only been identified as their own type since 2019. And it was only when I went to update this record that I noticed there was another palstave nearby, less than 130 metres away. Now, this one fits the type you'd call a primary phase palstave, but also fits the type of what you call a Norman unlooped palstave, which are also imported from central and northern France. And that got me wondering, what are the chances that we'd have two Middle Bronze Age palstaves, probably imported from France, being found so close together? Well, it doesn't seem so likely, actually, that these are separate events. These were probably buried at the same time, so this would have counted as a hoard. However, I didn't notice that in 2020 because I hadn't looked at the wider context of that axe head, and frankly, I didn't know the extra nuances of the Middle Bronze Age axe head typology at that time. So this already highlights one problem we have in the application of the Treasure Act, is if flows don't have that extra level of knowledge and don't look at the context, there's the high potential that we might miss potential hoards in the data set. But defining hoards based on spatial proximity isn't as simple as just saying objects are found close together. Here we have another case study you have recently studied, where you have a basal loop spearhead on the top left-hand side of your screen, a rapier on the top right, and a socketed, probably Wilton axe head in the bottom right. Now, crucially, if you look at the spearhead, you'll notice it's been broken into two parts. We don't think this is deliberate, it's probably from the plough, and then it's been scattered across the field over about 130, 150 metres. So that's telling us that objects can move quite a large distance in the soil. Now, you might say, well, look, the rapier and the socketed axe head fragment are really close to the spearhead tip. Maybe this is a disturbed hoard. But when we look at the chronology of these items, we actually notice that while the rapier overlaps both the spearhead and the axe head, they're actually quite different periods. And when I looked at my own database of these 2,100 Bronze Age hoards found in England, Scotland and Wales, I could only find two hoards which had all three items in them, and these were of a much larger size and in very different locations. So I don't think we could sustain that this is actually a scattered Bronze Age hoard. In which case, what is this cluster of finds? Well, you'll notice there's a blue line on there. That's a relatively major river in Oxfordshire. And we know that in the Bronze Age, people are regularly putting in metalwork into watery locations over large periods of time. It seems far more likely then to describe this area as some sort of wetland landscape, which has been repeatedly revisited to deposit metalwork. So hopefully those two case studies illustrate a problem that we have working with Bronze Age hoards through the treasure process. The first is it's possible when we have 10,000 finds that we've got a large number of unrecognised hoards on the PAS database, those hidden treasure cases. But similarly, identifying clusters isn't always straightforward. Now, the problem here really resulting all around this is that we don't really have a framework for classifying object scatters that provides a guide for the treasure process. There are lots of papers looking at the distances objects can move and the rate at which they degrade. But when you extend that back over 3,000 years, the reality is those numbers aren't terribly useful for classifying these hoards. And this is the problem that I really want to tackle throughout the rest of this paper. I wanted to do it through finds looking at Oxfordshire and provide a couple of examples of how we might assess the clusters that we see on the PAS database. But before doing that, it's worth asking, well, why does this matter? Well, from a purely functional perspective, it matters for the application of the Treasure Act because its flows provide a recommendation as to when scatters do and don't count as treasure. Now, if we can't provide a reliable framework and start disagreeing with us, it's setting very bad precedents for the application of that framework and can gum up the works. It matters, of course, to hoard nerds like myself because I want to know I've got the largest data set possible so that my patterns are reliable when I study them. But what I hope to show in the rest of the presentation is actually it helps us identify Bronze Age landscapes and provides us a reminder when creating our theoretical concepts for understanding the Bronze Age. The first question then I had to ask was, are there unrecognised Bronze Age clusters recorded on the database? And for this, I just looked at the county of Oxfordshire because that's the region I'm the flow for. It meant the data was readily accessible, and I also have the historic environment record data to compare my results to. And I identified clusters using a very simple algorithm which you can get in most GIS packages called dbScan. And having a play with different brackets, you can see that in the graph there, I set a cluster algorithm to 500 meters. So that's really quite broad. And so the minimum number of objects in a cluster had to be 2 items. And that identified all the clusters that are popping up in this GIF you can see here. Put together, the cluster analysis was able to identify 55 potential clusters in the county. So straight away, are there hidden clusters of finds in the database? Well, the answer is yes. Now, these clusters ranged in size and number of objects. Some were as small as just 2 finds, spread sometimes between as little as 10 meters, but sometimes as far away as 370 meters. But other clusters were much larger, having 10 to 20 finds, spread in areas as little as 90 meters distant, but also as large as 700 meters. But the crucial question about all these 55 clusters is, what should we describe them as? In 2 cases, I think we say that these aren't clusters at all. So for example, here we had 2 objects described as casting waste or bun ingots, which are divided by some field boundaries and a road. We only have a picture of one of these items, and I'll be honest, that's not particularly diagnostically Bronze Age. It very well could be, but it could be medieval or lots of different periods. And they're spread over a distance of 209 meters. So all of those factors combined together, I think, reduce the possibility of us being certain that this is a treasure case. And that happened in 2 instances. Similarly, we have cases where we have a couple of objects placed close together, which are both Bronze Age, which I think we can't fairly describe as being a hoard. So in this instance here, we have a nice gold bead, and we also have a blade fragment, probably from a sword, probably both late Bronze Age. Now, you don't typically find these items together in hoards, and when you look at the broader context, you'll see those double rings there on the map. Those represent barrows. And what we do have is precedent for Bronze Age metalwork being deposited in and around barrow landscapes. So rather than describing this as a Bronze Age finds cluster or hoard, it's probably more likely to represent repeated deposition in an already extant landscape. But this sort of precedent actually makes things quite complicated. So here we have another barrow landscape. These are represented by the small black dots on the map. And what you can see is, like in the previous example, we have a socketed axe head ringed in red and another sort of gold bar ingot placed in and around the barrow landscape. Now, feels much more like what we saw in the previous slide. We wouldn't call that a hoard. But in the top left of that map, you can see we've got objects which all fit Ewart Park assemblages. These are found near a barrow, and they're clearly in a landscape where we have precedent for repeated deposition of metalwork in and around a barrow landscape. But how should those 4 objects be described? I mean, I think fairly, we'd probably say it could be a hoard, but it could also relate to that barrow landscape, and we don't know it is one. And in this landscape, we have another, probably more complicated scenario. What you can see is a hill fort which has a postulated Bronze Age origins, although there's no archaeological evidence to support that, which has been an area where there's been extensive metal detecting in and around its hinterland. You can see that with all the quite grey light dots on the map. And within this area, we've got large amounts of Bronze Age metalwork. But how do we define these? because some are clusters of objects quite close together. You can see that with the green dots, but other ones with those purple ones are far more dispersed across this landscape. And when we have so much metal detecting in this area, should we not just recognise that we've got a bias to actually finding metalwork objects, and actually these aren't objects that are definitely related to one another? A bit like the way we would treat, for example, Roman numerals around a Roman villa. Regardless, I think this case study is actually quite exciting because what we have is suggested Bronze Age settlement in the area, particularly with some field systems that we found just north of this hill fort, and large amounts of metalwork which is essentially in the same landscape of those. Now, it's often quite rare that you find metalwork associated with settlement activity, so maybe we have a new kind of cluster that we should study when understanding the Bronze Age. And here's my last sort of complicated case study. This is around the River Ock, and this was close to those two power stays, which I think probably are a dispersed hoard. Now, all of these dots you can see on the map are Bronze Age objects, and you'll notice that we've got some objects which are similar types. So, for example, we've got two basal loop spearheads, we've got several rapier blades, we've got these strange mounts you can see on the top right-hand side of your screen, which are associated with really the earliest Iron Age, the Linth-Hour phase. Now, you might say, well, if we've got similar objects of similar types, maybe those are dispersed hoards. But without fail, so for example, looking at basal loop spearheads, you'll see that the same object types are actually in different locations, spread well over 500 meters. Now, either the plough was doing a lot of work moving these objects, or these were buried at different times. Now, there is a river, you can see in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen there, so maybe we've got a bit like that second case study I showed you, a wetland location which has been used for repeated deposition objects over a large period of time. However, if you look in the top right-hand corner of your screen, we've got essentially Middle Bronze Age objects. So we've got rapiers, we've got a side loop spearhead, all of which are essentially contemporary to one another. So actually, I think we've got both. We have a wetland location, but also probably a scattered Bronze Age hoard in that top right-hand corner, which has been dragged downwards by the plough. So at this point, it's probably a fair question to say, well, Ed, you teed us up with this presentation talking about Bronze Age hoards, and all of these have been quite fringe cases. Where are they? Well, the good news is, from those 55 clusters I first identified, we did actually have some Bronze Age hoards in a couple cases which are quite definitive. So here we've got lots of what looks like quite late Bronze Age metalwork, all given the same find spot. Now, it might be that that was around about the centre of the field, so people don't know the exact locations of all of these finds. However, that actually find spot was located in the corner of the field, and they were often recorded by different flows. So I'm more minded that actually these were found close together. Why they weren't recorded as a hoard, I'm not too sure, frankly, but it seems like a good candidate. Similarly, what you can see here are three objects, all of which have precedent in being found together in late Bronze Age hoards, found very close together. But what you also see is how we can't always trust the algorithm to identify those clusters, because that fourth item, highlighted in red, probably a sword blade, probably contemporary of those objects, is found a really quite long distance away from those other three objects, almost 500 meters. So the pragmatic thing to do, I think, in this instance is say, yes, we have a Bronze Age hoard made up of those first three items found close together, and maybe to make a note that there is potentially a fourth object which was originally part of the assemblage, but that we can't be certain and so shouldn't be treated as part of that treasure case. Finally, in addition to all those other cases that I've shown you, we have instances of what I'd call possible hoards, but we can't really be certain. So here we have two finds given the same 10-figure grid reference, all in the same field, but I suspect in that instance probably what's happened is the metal detector said, oh, it's been found in that field, which is 500 meters long, 250 meters wide. Now there's a reason these couldn't be part of a scattered hoard, but is there any reason that they couldn't be part of those other case studies we've highlighted before? I'm not so sure. So, taking a breather, what I hope to have shown you up to this point is that, yes, we are able to identify Bronze Age clusters of finds. There were 55 of them. 2 of those probably don't count as clusters, but the remaining 53 we need to understand. And some of those could be hoards, but other ones have association with rivers, barrow landscapes, and possibly even settlements. When we put all those numbers together, you can see there on the right-hand side of our screen that we actually have a range of different options. And I think if I was to go back and do this analysis again, I'd probably actually interpret far more of those landscapes as having multiple possibilities to them. But at this point, it's worth asking, well, what do those results mean for the national data set? So that DB scan clustering algorithm, you can do very quickly. So I did it for all of the 10,000 Bronze Age metalwork finds that are recorded on the PAS database. By taking the proportions of how I've defined those clusters in Oxfordshire and extrapolating it to the 1,298 clusters that algorithm identified, we can estimate the number of different sites that we could be having in the PAS database. And this would suggest we've got around about 450 new hoards, potentially 70 new wetland sets or settlement sites, and then probably 70 clusters which aren't really clusters at all. So are those large numbers? Well, I certainly think so. Typically, PhD study about 300 sort of sites or so. I think the largest metalwork study I know looks at about 600 Bronze Age metalwork hoards. So yeah, we've got between 1 and 1.5 PhDs worth of data there, which has gone unrecognised. That seems like an awesome amount. Similarly, if we combine those potential 450 new hoards with the 500 already recognised on the PAS database, that means we're getting around 40% of all our metalwork hoard data recorded just on the PAS website alone. So clearly, this is going to have some significance for metalwork studies and anyone wanting to study Bronze Age hoards. If we've got such a large corpus of data in one website, that's going to vastly increase our ability to understand this phenomenon. Similarly, I think it's worth noting that these clusters of finds are recorded as single objects in the vast majority of cases. Now that means we have full-on descriptions that you can see in the bottom right-hand side of your screen, nice publication quality pictures, and actually data that's recorded to a higher level than is typically seen in a Bronze Age hoard report. So we have a vast data set here which can help us improve our understanding of this phenomenon. But perhaps more excitingly, I think, rather than identifying large numbers of Bronze Age hoards, has been this study's ability to identify new Bronze Age landscapes. It's notable that in Oxfordshire, we've got large amounts of metalwork being deposited in and around river areas in clusters that hadn't previously been identified on the historical environment record, for instance. Now, we know people are burying metalwork repeatedly over time with sites like Flag Fen, but discovering these can be quite hard. And actually, because we're identifying these clusters through the PAS database, maybe these should be target sites for future investigations, maybe a geophysical survey or targeted excavation. Similarly exciting for me was that settlement landscape around a hill fort where we've got large amounts of metalwork being discovered, so a large corpus to study, potentially associated with Bronze Age settlements. Because we tend not to find loads of metalwork on settlements, so that might provide a new data set to help unify our development of settlement landscapes over time and our changes in metalwork. I think also what these case studies do to help improve our understanding of the Bronze Age is also a bit of a theoretical point. Now, I'm hoping you're all familiar with this image here of something which could be identified as a duck or a rabbit, and really the question is, it's neither one of those. It's a piece of drawing which we ascribe meaning to depending on your perspective. Now, me calling certain clusters as hoards or wetland landscapes or associated with barrows is a similar conundrum. The reality is these are boxes we put around areas to study these objects, but they probably wouldn't have been recognised as a hoard or a wetland landscape in the Bronze Age. So what the sort of ambiguity, I think, showed in the previous case studies, that we need to be cognizant of that and try and work around that divide to better understand the changes that are happening in the county. Which is all to say, I think there's a large amount of underutilised potential then that we can see in the PAS dataset. I've tried to put some of the key findings here. I think I've shown that there is untapped potential because there's hundreds of clusters of finds which haven't been recognised by flows and just there waiting for someone to go out and study them. Similarly, these clusters can help identify new archaeological landscapes, but we probably need an improved theoretical framework for understanding them. This, of course, all matters for the application of the Treasure Act, but does mean, I think, that we've got a large amount of data that we need to study when we're looking at Bronze Age hoards. And I'll just leave this teaser out there because obviously you're not just Bronze Age people, you're people interested hopefully in the Iron Age as well. The Bronze Age only makes up about 1.3% of all the metalwork on the PAS database. The Iron Age makes up about 5.8%. If there's clusters in the Bronze Age data, I suspect they exist also in the Iron Age data. So that data is there, available, ready for you to study. It'd be great to see what you could do with it. And I think I'll end it there. So thanks again, once again, to the organisers for putting on this presentation. If you do have any questions or want to use this data more, you can get in touch with the PAS directly or get in touch with myself at edward.caswell@oxfordshire.gov.uk. Thank you once again.